This lesson teaches RYA coastal skipper and yachtmaster students everything they need to know about pilotage, which might be described as the use of fixed visual references by sight or radar to guide oneself to a destination. It's important to realize that when you're navigating in confined waters, there is insufficient time to keep plotting on a chart, and whilst GPS can assist, it would be extremely unwise to rely solely on it when any glitch could leave you completely lost among the rocks. Big ship pilots and naval officers still use visual fixing and radar for pilotage for just this reason. And skippers who install a chart plotter at the wheel and try to drive their boat around the chart are riding for an expensive and possibly life-threatening fall. There are many tools to help accomplish efficient visual pilotage. Transits, lead bearings, back bearings, clearing bearings, turning bearings, and depth contours are the main ones. We briefly covered transits in the lesson on buoyage. The idea is that in order to navigate safely in or out of a harbour, estuary, or creek, you keep two distinct charted features in line. All sorts of things might be used: posts, white painted diamonds on walls or buildings, buildings themselves, even distinctive trees, which can be a bit of a problem after a major storm. If they're purpose-built, they might be lit with almost any colour light. In this example, we are told that in order to navigate into this small island, we must keep two white posts in transit. We're also told that the transit is on 300 degrees true, but that's really only for information. The key thing is to keep the posts in line, which might mean keeping your heading to port or starboard of 300 degrees if the tide is setting across the transit. Here we can see two boats, neither is on transit. A is slightly to port and must adjust her course to starboard to bring herself back onto the transit. B is slightly to starboard and needs to alter course to port. Sometimes we use natural transits. They don't even have to appear on the chart. Here's one in the Solent, which does appear on the chart. We're told that the transit is when Egypt Point, west of Cowes, is just open on Castle Point, east of Cowes, on 272 degrees. And remember that everything that's written on the chart is relative to true north. Here we're looking at two small islands, the right-hand edges of which are about to come into transit, or close. Here the transit is open, but as we proceed it will be closing. And by the time we get here, it is closed. Lead bearings serve the same purpose, but you have to use a compass. Here we're informed that in order to keep in the channel, we need to keep the radio tower on 106 degrees true. A is too far to port, and B is too far to starboard. You monitor your position relative to the lead bearing using a hand-bearing compass. So in this case, with the lead bearing on 106 degrees true, we need to keep it at 112 degrees on the hand-bearing compass, assuming of course that magnetic variation is 6 degrees west. A sees the radio tower at 121 degrees magnetic, so she is too far to port and must alter course to starboard. B sees it at 107 degrees magnetic. She must alter course to port. Back bearings are exactly the same, but in reverse. A reads 121 degrees and must turn to port. B sees it at 107 degrees magnetic and must alter course to starboard. Just as with transit, your heading may never be exactly the same as the lead bearing if there is a cross set. Clearing bearings are extremely useful when you can't see a danger, either because it's below current sea level or it's dark. We looked at this briefly in the lesson on electronic navigation. Here, a boat is beating to windward and must tack before she reaches a treacherous reef lying just below the waves. The navigator draws a clearing bearing, which the yacht must not cross, on the chart from the port channel buoy, allowing a small safety margin. This gives a clearing bearing of 228 degrees true, 234 degrees magnetic. As the yacht approaches the reef, the bearing on the port tack, the bearing to the channel buoy, slowly decreases, and she tacks just before it reaches 234 degrees magnetic. If she was going the other way, beating into a northeasterly, then the bearing on the buoy would increase as she approaches the clearing bearing. You could use a GPS waypoint, which of course does not need to be located on any charted feature. You just need to remember that because GPSs give bearing to waypoint as true, you can completely ignore variation. Turning bearings can be used to let you know when you need to turn. Here we're navigating north towards a bend in the river, keeping a flagpole at 006 degrees magnetic. We need to turn onto our new heading of 084 degrees magnetic when the conspicuous buildings off on our port side bear 291 degrees magnetic. You can even give yourself a bit of a countdown, which can be especially valuable if you're under sail and your new course dictates a tack or jibe. We achieve this by drawing a number of bearings to the turning bearing, with each stepping us closer by a regular distance, perhaps a cable, to the position where we must turn. Following a depth contour is occasionally useful. If the contours run pretty straight or curve gently, it works a treat. If they've got lots of kinks in them, it's not so good. Here, in order to navigate into Newtown Creek at night, which, apart from one dimly lit West Cardinal buoy, is totally unlit, one strategy would be to approach the shore well to the west, and then follow a contour. Notice we've positioned the waypoint just east of a kink in the contour, and from the waypoint round, into, and through the quite narrow entrance, the contour gently curves round to starboard. Of course, to accomplish this, you need to know the height of tide at your estimated time of arrival, and it's always best to do this in advance, given a range of possible ETAs. Here we're using an ETA of 1000 hours, when the predicted height of tide at nearby Yarmouth is 2.2 meters. So we'll be on the 2-meter contour when our depth sounder reads 4.2 meters, assuming of course that it's adjusted to read depth of water. As we come on to 4.2 meters, we turn to port onto an approximate heading of 070 degrees true. And if the depth starts to increase, we turn slightly to starboard. If it decreases, we turn to port. Actually, rather easier said than done, as there are always lumps and bumps. OK, let's string all this together into a pilotage plan. Take out your RYA Chart 4 and examine Chart 4A for Dawson Harbour. Let's imagine that it's the 27th of June, we own a 30-foot yacht with a draft of 1.5 metres, we're based in St Kilda Marina and wish to visit North Matville in Dawson Harbour for lunch, arriving alongside by 12:30 on the town hall clock. Well before we get close, we need to prepare a pilotage plan, because, as you can see from the chart, the approach to Dawson Harbour and the navigation within could be a bit tricky, and we believe in the 6 P's. Perfect, planning, prevents, poor, performance. Yes, I know that's only 5 P's, but you can work the other one out for yourselves. With the chart in front of us, the first thing to do is to read the entry for Dawson Harbour on page 86 in our almanac. It's not a bad idea to use a highlighting pen to mark the most important points. We can see that Dawson Harbour is a secondary port of Colville, and that from the height differences in the table and the note on the top of the right-hand column, there is a big tidal range, and tidal streams can run at up to 4 knots through the various channels. At the same time in the description, we're told that the entrance and main channels are accessible at all states of the tide. Since it's only about 6 miles from St Kilda Marina to the beginning of the transit between Outer Rock and Middle Rock, it won't take very long to get there, and I guess if it's a sunny day, we might even go for a bit of a sail around first. But whatever, let's try to arrive when the tide is flooding up the channels and leave on the ebb. So, at this point, it's worth working out the times and heights of high and low water at Dawson Harbour, and the height of tide at a range of times around our ETA. Let's say 11:30, 1200 and 12:30. Well, get to it. When you think you've got an answer, press the button. Dawson Harbour is a secondary port to Colville, and if you were to look at the tidal graph for Dawson Harbour, you can see that it's centred on low water. Low water Colville is at 0726 time zone minus 0100. And if we interpolate between a time difference of minus 6 minutes at 0700 and minus 30 minutes at 1300, we get a difference at 0726 of about minus 8 minutes, which would make low water at 0718 time zone minus 0100. But it's glorious summer, so we're on daylight saving time. So low water is at 0818 Southern Peninsula daylight saving time. The height of tide in Colville at low water is 0.8 metres. And if we interpolate between a height difference of 0.5 metres when the height at Colville is also 0.5, and 1 metre when the height at Colville is 1.4, we get a difference of between plus 0.6 and 0.7. So let's call it 0.6, making the height of tide at Dawson at low water 1.4 metres. High water Colville is at 1338 time zone minus 1. And we interpolate between minus 38 minutes at 1300 and minus 14 minutes at 1900 to get a difference of minus 35 minutes, making high water Dawson 1303 time zone minus 1, or 1403 Southern Peninsula daylight saving time. The height of tide at Colville at high water is 4.5 metres, and interpolating between plus 1.7 at 3.9 and plus 2.8 at 4.8 gives a difference of roughly 2.4. So the height of tide at Dawson at high water is 6.9 metres. Low water at Colville in the evening is at 20:04 time zone minus 1, and interpolating between minus 6 minutes at 1900 and minus 30 minutes at 0100 gives a difference of minus 11 minutes, making low water Dawson at 20:53 Southern Peninsula daylight saving time. Finally, there's a difference of between plus 0.5 and plus 0.6 in the heights of low water, so let's call it 0.5, making the height of tide at Dawson at evening low water 1.1 metres. We want to arrive alongside by 12:30, so with local high water at 14:03, it looks good for arriving on the flood and leaving on the ebb after lunch. The tidal curve for Dawson is centred on low water, and if you carefully plot heights, you should get 3.4 metres at 11:30, 3.7 metres at 1200, and 4.3 metres at 12:30. If we inspect a smaller scale chart, RYA chart 3 in this case, we can see that tidal streams in the area off Dawson Harbour only set roughly east for 4 out of every 13 hours, turning from setting east to west 1.5 hours before high water Victoria. Yes, remember, Victoria, Victoria, always Victoria. And from setting west to east 5.5 hours before Victoria. High water Victoria is at 11:58 UT, which is 13:58 Southern Peninsula Daylight Saving Time, so if we aim to arrive at the outer end of Flanker Channel at about 1100, to give ourselves an hour and a half to navigate up to North Matville, a distance of around 6.5 miles, we'll be able to carry the tide down from St Kilda, and if we leave after lunch, we can carry it back home. The pilotage notes give an approach waypoint. Always plot waypoints on your chart before programming them into your GPS. I'll say that again. Always plot waypoints on your chart before programming them into your GPS. It is not unknown for waypoints printed in almanacs, pilot books, and magazine articles to be just plain wrong. Your instructor was once approaching a tricky pilotage in the Channel Islands using a pilot book from a very reputable and usually highly reliable publisher. He'd drawn a waypoint onto the chart in the pilot book, measured his latitude and longitude, and carefully programmed it into his GPS. As he was getting close to the waypoint, he couldn't make what he was seeing add up with what he expected from the chart. It turned out that the latitude and longitude scales on the chart in the pilot book were wrong, out by a minute of longitude. Anyway, let's assume that we program this waypoint into our GPS and another crew member checks it. Now we should draw a pilotage plan. This is a simple chart omitting all but the essential pilotage information that can be taken into the cockpit and, as we follow it, can be used to regularly fix our position and record our turns using visual references. Waterproof paper is good. One of those multicoloured biros is very useful. A whiteboard works kind of okay, but not if you use dry wipe pens. Use a wax pencil instead. It erases easily with a drop of surgical spirit. The pilotage notes then tell us that the recommended passage through the Flanker Channel carries a least depth of 3.3 metres, so we don't have to worry about the depth of water. And even at its slightly narrower southern end, there's still more than a cable between the 2-metre contours on either side. The pilotage notes tell us to use the conspicuous radio mast as a leading bearing. Let's call our waypoint Point 1. Here we turn onto 158 degrees magnetic, keeping the conspicuous radio tower and the hotel on 158 degrees for approximately 1.8 miles until Dawson Head bears 271 degrees magnetic at point 2. Then we turn onto 271 degrees magnetic and keep the headland on that bearing for approximately 1.25 miles until the east cardinal post A and the north cardinal post B come into transit on approximately 197 degrees magnetic at point 3. Then we follow the transit for the two cardinals, A and B, for approximately 0.8 miles, until the church in Old Dawson bears 313 degrees magnetic at point 4. Now we turn onto 133 degrees magnetic, and use the church as a back bearing to keep ourselves on track. We keep on course for about 0.6 miles until we reach the 2-metre contour, which is where it pays dividends to have worked out the local tide times and heights up front. Let's assume that it's now 1200 when we calculated that the height of tide should be 3.7 metres. So, when we reached 5.7 metres, 2 metres of charted depth plus 3.7 metres height of tide on our depth sounder, assuming it's adjusted to read depth of water, we are at point 5. And we turn on to an approximately easterly heading, leaving the north cardinal post C to starboard, and then keep following the 2-metre contour, gradually turning southeast, then south, until we arrive in North Matville. Job done. Time for a good lunch. You thought we were all done, didn't you? There are a few other bits and bobs that don't fit anywhere else in the course but relate to pilotage. Whenever you are sailing into a port, it's important that you carefully examine everything written in the almanac. Take a look at Port Fitzroy on page 88. Note especially that we're advised that the port does not openly encourage pleasure craft, and that small craft intending to enter Fitzroy through Fiddler's Race are strongly advised to plan the passage thoroughly, because the tidal stream attains rates of up to 6 knots, and during wind over tide conditions, severe overfalls in the race make this passage untenable. We looked at this in the lesson on tidal streams. All vessels must contact Port Fitzroy on Channel 74 and request permission to enter the harbour. Vessels less than 20 metres length overall must enter the channel between number 7 and number 9 starboard hand marks, or, if approaching from the east, between number 8 and number 10. Vessels intending to leave Old Town must receive permission before shipping, etc., etc., etc. Maybe you'd be better making for Blackmill Marina. You also need to know the international port traffic signals. Here they are. I'm not going to read them out. They also appear on page 3 of your RYA Almanac along with some explanatory notes. The thing is that, as it says in the Almanac, the international system is gradually being introduced, but its general adoption is likely to take many years. Until then, many harbours, especially those catering principally to fishing vessels or leisure craft, use a plethora of different signals, even still flags in some places. Details will be given under Lights and Marks for the port entry in the Almanac. Finally, there are local notices to mariners, which might specify any temporary restrictions or changes to the pilotage or regulations. Unfortunately, there is no national, let alone international, source to get your hands on. However, it's always worth Googling a harbour to see if there's anything you need to know, especially if it's at the end of a long passage on a lee shore with no immediate alternative. For example, some small harbours on the Normandy coast occasionally close for a month or two in the winter. Well done! You've completed the lesson on pilotage. Now go on to complete exercise H.